questions. Questions orales. L'honorable chef de l'opposition.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. After 8 years, Mr. Speaker, this Prime Minister has replaced the joy of Christmas for children with poverty. 27,000 young people in Quebec have had to ask for a Christmas present under the 29th edition of the Santa Claus operation. One letter says, I'd like to be able to get a gift so that we can eat well on Christmas Eve. This has never been seen before, according to the coordinator. Young people are looking for warm clothes like snowsuits. When will the Prime Minister reverse these inflationary deficits so that our kids can have the joy of Christmas back? The Honourable President of the Treasury Board.
Side of the House, we will always invest in our economy and help vulnerable Canadians at the same time. That's why our Canada Child Benefit has lifted almost 500,000 children out of poverty, Mr. Speaker. That's why we put in place $10 a day childcare. Why, Mr. Speaker? So families can go back to work. And that's why we are stabilizing grocery prices with the law that we introduce in this House today, and we encourage every member of this House to vote in favor of it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. The Environment Minister, the Liberal Environment Minister, is imposing a tax that punishes single moms, farmers, and small business. At the same time, he's been taking 60,000-kilometer flights in business class, obviously, and his climate change coordinator took flights to the equivalent of going around the globe 4 times, Mr. Speaker. When will the government stop the hypocrisy and the taxes? The Honourable Minister of Innovation. Mr. Speaker, I think Canadians watching us will see where the hypocrisy is. The Conservative leader, Mr. Speaker, was against all the investments we've made in green energy, in green aluminum, in green steel, in battery plants. I've never heard the opposition leader speak out in favor of the Canadian economy, in favor of the energy transition, and in favor of Canadian workers. That's what we're doing on this side of the House. We're fighting for workers and the green economy.
After 8 years, we've entered the next phase of this Prime Minister's economic misery. We've seen just inflation, and today we learn Canada's in a state of stagflation, as our economy shrunk by 1.1% in the most recent quarter, while the American economy boomed at 5%. Wow. Mr. Speaker, this is the result of high taxes, big deficits, and crippling red tape. At the same time as the prices rise for Canadians, their wages are falling down. The economy is now smaller than it was on a per capita basis 5 years ago. Why is it that the American economy is roaring while this Prime Minister's economy is snoring?
The Honourable President of the Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, despite the trite rhymes coming from the other side of the House, I'd like to remind everybody in this House that we actually have an economic plan, unlike the opposition. Our GDP today, Mr. Speaker, is at 4.1% above pre-pandemic levels. That is higher than Italy, the European Union, France, and Germany, Mr. Speaker, and the IMF projects that Canada will have the highest economic growth in the G7 in 2024. Mr. Speaker, that's an economic plan at work.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, in fact, the economy is smaller today than it was 5 years ago on a per capita basis, and the IMF projects Canada will have the worst economic growth over the next 6 years and the next 40 years. This is the result of high tax hypocrisy. The Environment Minister, it now comes out after he punishes single moms and small business owners and farmers for heating their homes and driving their vehicles. He has flown 60,000 kilometers. His climate change chair has flown the equivalent of going around the world 4 times, and now they're off with 70,000 other people at a air-conditioned dome in the desert in a petro state, Mr. Speaker. Why won't they park the jet, end the hypocrisy, and axe the tax.
The Honourable Minister for Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, there is one number that the Conservative leader will not talk about, Mr. Speaker, is that Canada ranked third in the world for foreign direct investment. Yesterday, Mr. Speaker, just yesterday, Dow Chemical announced one of its largest investment in 126 years in Fort Saskatchewan, Alberta, Mr. Speaker. This is going to be thousands of jobs, hundreds of thousands of hours of construction, Mr. Speaker. This is how you lead the economy. This is how you lead a country. This is how you lead to bring investment in this country, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
I think he wants to lead the party, Mr. Speaker. While his Prime Minister leads the economy into a ditch, the high tax hypocrisy knows no bounds. Now First Nations are speaking up. First it was revolting Liberal MPs who were worried about losing their seats because of the Prime Minister's tax on home heat. Then it was other premiers refusing to collect the tax. Then it was farmers fighting for their ability to produce food without taxes. And now First Nations, over 100 First Nations communities have taken this government to court because they're violating the rights of our First People with the carbon tax on rural and remote people. When will they stop violating the constitutional rights of First Nations and axe the tax?
The Honourable Minister.
Well, first of all, Mr. Speaker, they're not our First People, but they are our First Nations, which are independent First Nations. And, Mr. Speaker, this government from no, they're not. Listen to that, Mr. Speaker. The colonialism in this place from the Conservatives just won't quit. I will say, Mr. Speaker, that we respect First Nations on this side. We know that they're leaders. That's why we've invested hundreds of thousands of millions of dollars in First Nations to ensure equity in water, in child welfare, and in housing, and we'll continue, Mr. Speaker.
L'honorable député de La Prairie.
The Honourable Member for La Prairie.
Will the Honourable Member from Battle Creek Crowfoot please wait his turn to ask a question? The Honourable
Member for La Prairie.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, Quebec alone gets as many asylum seekers as all the other provinces combined. This has cost Quebecers $460 million, even though refugee claims are a federal responsibility. Quebecers shouldn't have to foot the bill for Canadians, nor do they deserve the arrogance of an immigration minister, even though he's from Quebec, who tells them he's not a bank machine. It's a shame to have to go over a Quebec minister's head to solve a problem for Quebecers, but that's what we have to do. We have no choice. So I call on the Minister of Finance. Will she reimburse Quebecers?
The Honourable Minister.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, clearly there's a global refugee crisis. Canada is affected by it too. We have a moral duty to do something. Asylum seekers are a shared jurisdiction between Quebec and Canada, and we will continue to have discussions with Quebec City. The Honourable Member for La Prairie. Mr. Speaker, it took a minister from New Brunswick to finally get the federal government to acknowledge Quebecers' generosity toward refugee claimants. On Tuesday, the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs acknowledged that Quebec's public services and community organizations were overwhelmed. At least he acknowledged it. That's a start. Meanwhile, Quebecers have had to pay $460 million, even though it's a federal responsibility. On Tuesday, the minister undertook to speak to his colleague, the finance minister. Has he done that? And when will they send a check to Quebec for $460 million? The Honourable Minister of Transport. Mr. Speaker, I'm glad my colleague has acknowledged the work done by my colleague and friend, the Minister for Intergovernmental Affairs. There have been very constructive talks between the immigration minister and his counterpart in Quebec City. I've had a number of meetings with other members of Mr. Legault's cabinet. These are solid ties. The Bloc is trying to suggest that there's a squabble, but the only fight here is one that the Bloc is trying to pick, but there is no such fight because we're working together well.
Burnaby Sud.
The honourable member for Burnaby South.
The U.S. officially charged an Indian government employee with attempting to assassinate a member of the Sikh community in New York. The target was on the very same list as Sikh Canadian Hardeep Singh Nijjar, who was murdered in Surrey. These new allegations make Sikh Canadians feel even more unsafe. Meanwhile, the Conservative leader is siding with the Modi government and blaming Canada. What is the government doing to ensure the safety of Sikh Canadians amid these serious allegations?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Leader of the NDP for that important question. Obviously, the RCMP, with their policing partners across the country, are very engaged with the Sikh community and other communities across the country that understandably feel an increased threat level with respect to what the U.S. Justice Department filed in a court in the United States yesterday. It is obviously a source of concern that's understandable in the Sikh community. The RCMP are continuing to collaborate with American law enforcement partners and will do everything necessary to ensure the safety of Canadians.
Hear, hear.
L'honorable député de Burnaby Sud.
The honourable member for Burnaby South. We learned with great sadness that children in Quebec are asking Santa Claus for warm clothes and food. Operation Santa Claus has seen an increase in the number of these requests. 2,000 more requests have been made over year. How is the government going to deal with this crisis?
L'honorable Ministre.
The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, we are here on this side of the House continuing to build an economy that works for all. That's why we introduced a bill here in the House today to build the economy for children, for seniors, for small business, and for grocery prices. That's our plan, Mr. Speaker, and I would encourage everyone in this place to vote in favor of it.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
In an interview with CFRA's Bill Carroll, Dr. Barry Dworkin reported the case of a United Kingdom doctor who came to Canada fully qualified and ready to practice, but denied the ability to take a work permit simply because she was self-employed, an obvious paperwork snafu. She joins the 20,000 immigrants to Canada who are doctors that can't work, 32,000 nurses. Why won't the government take my common sense plan to bring in a Blue Seal professional standard that will allow immigrant doctors, nurses, and other professionals to quickly prove they are qualified, get to work, earning powerful paychecks, serving patients in need?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to the member across for the good question. We are working in partnership with the Ontario government to help reestablish all the foreign doctors, making sure that they can get accredited. Thank you so much for the question.
The Honourable Member from Calgary Forest Lawn.
8 years of this Liberal NDP government, they're not worth the cost. While the U.S. economy is booming with a growth of 5.2%, Canada's economy is shrinking. Canada will have the worst GDP per capita growth in all developed nations. In fact, U.S. GDP per person will be $80,000. Canada's only $50,000. Never has a government spent and taxed so much on Canadians with so little to show. Will the Finance Minister stand up today and tell Canadians why she's taking more from them and making them poorer?
Yeah. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, while the Conservatives continue to talk down the economy, allow me to add in a few more facts into this House. We have ensured that 1.1 million additional jobs are available to Canadians since the end of the pandemic, Mr. Speaker. And that's important because those are well-paying jobs. Mr. Speaker, wages have actually increased and outpaced inflation in this country. And the report that the Conservative colleague cites, Mr. Speaker, indicates that there was a significant upwards revision of Canada's growth in the second quarter in this country, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The honourable member from Northumberland, Peterborough South.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. After 8 years as NDP Liberal government, the financial gap between Americans and Canadians has never been larger. The average GDP per capita in the United States is over $80,000. In Canada, it's merely $50,000. Unbelievably, Mr. Speaker, the situation is getting worse. The growth was over 5% in the United States this year. In Canada, it's shrinking by more than 1%. When will this government finally take responsibility for failing Canadians and change direction and adopt a common sense plan led by a common sense leader?
Once again, encourage all members, especially the member from Timmins James Bay, to wait his turn to ask a question. The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the member because he gives me the opportunity to talk about an American investment that just happened yesterday, Mr. Speaker. In fact, Dow Chemical made one of the largest investments in 126 years of history, Mr. Speaker. They're going to invest more than $10 billion in Fort Saskatchewan, Alberta, Mr. Speaker, to do the first net zero ethylene plant in the world, Mr. Speaker. We're going to be producing green plastics. We're going to create jobs. We're going to grow the economy. That's a plan for the future, Mr. Speaker, and we're going to put it in place, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member from Northumberland, Peterborough South.
Thank you very much. The reality is the more this government spends, the poorer Canadians get. Over the last 8 years, this government has imposed a record tax burden on Canadians, levels of debt and deficits never seen before in this country, and the result is the worst per capita growth rate since the Great Depression. Record food bank usage, 2 million Canadians going to food bank every month. Why are these Liberals so hell-bent to bankrupt Canadians?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, our job as a government has been to balance compassion with fiscal responsibility, and that's exactly what we've done. We are there for Canadians with the Canada Child Benefit. We are there for families with supports. We're there for our seniors with supports, Mr. Speaker. And when the member opposite talks about being there for Canadians, I wonder why that very member has been filibustering our motion on the Canada Pension Plan in Finance Committee for weeks now, Mr. Speaker. We will continue to be there for Canadians.
The honourable member for Charlesbourg-Haut-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, yesterday we learned the U.S. economy grew by 5%, while in Canada our economy shrank by 1.1%. The American economy is booming and Canada's is stalled. Americans are getting richer, Canadians are getting poorer. Given these figures, will the government admit their economic plan is a failure? The Honourable Minister of Transport. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to commend my colleague's courage in asking a question in French. It's not easy for a francophone in the Conservative caucus, and even though I disagree with him, all Liberals here will stand up for his right to speak French. The Honourable Member for Charlesbourg-Haut-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, to answer clearly in French, a comment like that, I'd like to point out that my colleague apologized at committee. Can I continue, Mr. Speaker? Okay. My question is, Operation Santa Claus has been around since 1995 in Quebec. Young people are sending letters to Santa Claus. Normally they ask for toys, but this year they're asking for warm boots and snowsuits. Does this make any sense for this to be the situation we're in? The Honourable Minister of Transport. Mr. Speaker, there are two official languages here, English and French. Both can be used. I would ask members to please stay quiet and calm while a person answers a question. The Honourable Minister of Transport, from the top. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Once again, French needs to be respected in this place. Both official languages should be respected in this place. And if a colleague answers in their mother tongue, that should be respected, whether it's English or French. Once again, I commend the courage of my colleague. It must not be easy being a Francophone conservative, given the tyranny of their colleagues. We will always stand up for the right to speak in French. The honourable member for Avignon, Lamitis, Matane, Matapédia. Mr. Speaker, COP28 kicks off today, and already the Liberals have had time to make another cowardly decision on climate change. Yesterday, Canada announced it would not allow the final declaration to state that we will one day have to move away from fossil fuels. The COP hadn't even started yet, and already Canada was fighting alongside the other petromonarchies to pollute more and more. To quote Greenpeace, the government is seriously slowing down the global fight against climate change. Mr. Speaker, why are the Liberals sabotaging the world's efforts to fight climate change? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. COP28 is the next major step in the collective effort to strengthen public safety, economic prosperity, and the well-being of our planet. We recognize that there are still challenges to be met. Canada is willing to work with its partners to accelerate global efforts in order to reach the main goal of the Paris Agreement, and that is to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member for Repentigny. Bad news for the Liberals, Mr. Speaker. Their carbon capture strategy, the one they've been hiding behind at COP28, was panned by the OECD last week. A report from the International Energy Agency warns that it's a mistake to rely too heavily on carbon capture. The IEA warns that we need to start letting go of the illusion we will capture implausibly large amounts of CO2. It insists there's no alternative to switching to clean energy. When will the Liberals finally understand that their carbon capture strategy they're talking about in Dubai is nothing but a mirage? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Bloc acknowledges that the federal and provincial governments have an important role to play in this issue of fighting climate change. It's ironic that the Bloc is calling for the cancellation of projects when they're constantly telling the federal government to mind its own business. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, member for Repentigny. Mr. Speaker, history is repeating itself at COP28. Canada is once again conjuring up a mirage of green oil. And while the Minister of the Environment is making fine speeches in Dubai, back home in Canada, oil company Suncor announced on Monday it was increasing production with the resumption of operations at the Terra Nova oil field in Newfoundland. Once again, while the minister is making fine speeches, oil is flowing like never before back here in Canada, all while the planet is burning. When will the Liberals stop being part of the climate problem? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the question from my friend and colleague in the Bloc. The oil and gas industries make significant contributions to Canada's economy. They are also the largest emitters of GHG emissions. And that's why the oil patch is a key part of our plan to reduce emissions. This government plans to publish a plan for caps by the end of this year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
And London Kent, Middlesex.
Speaker, after enduring 8 years of this NDP Liberal government, 1 in 5 households in Ontario are struggling to put food on their tables. That adds up to 2.8 million people, including 700,000 children. This is shocking. This is the highest record numbers that we've ever seen. It's painfully clear that this Prime Minister is not worth the cost. So will the Prime Minister tell his appointed senators to stop delaying Bill C-234 and to pass the bill now to bring lower prices for food for all Canadians?
The Honourable President of the Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, we introduced legislation in this House today which seeks to modernize competition laws to stabilize grocery prices, and we encourage everyone in this chamber to vote in favor, including the member opposite. In addition, Mr. Speaker, I wonder why the party opposite continually votes against measures that aim to make life more affordable for Canadians, whether it is the Canada Child Benefit, whether it is $10 a day childcare, whether it is supports for small businesses. Every single time the party opposite votes against, and it's really difficult to understand what is their plan.
The honourable member from Lambton Kent Middlesex.
Well, Mr. Speaker, under this government, there's been more people using a food bank than ever before. It's record numbers, and this Prime Minister is responsible for bringing record-level hunger to Ontario. Now, I understand that the self-proclaimed Socialist Environment Minister is threatened to resign if the bill passes, but Canadian farmers need this carve-out immediately. This will make food prices cheaper because if you're taxing farmers who grow the food, you're taxing Canadians who buy the food. So again, will the Prime Minister tell his appointed senators to stop delaying Bill C-234 and pass the bill so we can bring home lower prices for groceries for all Canadians?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just start by reminding the members opposite that the Senate is independent, and the only senators that sit in a caucus sit in that Conservative caucus. And I'd add, Mr. Speaker, that farmers understand the importance of fighting climate change and reducing emissions, and I'd thank that farmer for running her last election campaign on pricing carbon. That's why our pollution pricing policy reflects the realities of Canada's agriculture industry. We've spent almost $500 million on R&D and adoption for clean technologies for grain drying. We spent $12 million to reduce methane emissions from cattle, and we've spent $670 million to support the adoption of greenhouse gas reduction practices on farms, and we'll keep supporting farmers because they're key to fighting climate change.
It's usually Wednesdays that people are quite hopped up. It's a little surprising that it's happening today on a Thursday. I ask all members, please, allow the person who has the floor to speak so that we can hear the question and hear the answer. L'honorable député de...
The honourable member for Beauce. Mr. Speaker, the costly Bloc Liberal coalition showed us once again yesterday they aren't worth the cost. They rejected our motion to force the Senate to pass our common sense bill C-234. After 8 years, when Canadians have never been in such dire straits, these two parties want to increase the carbon tax even more radically. Canadian farmers need our support. Will the Prime Minister tell his own appointed senators to stop blocking Bill C-234 and bring down the cost of groceries for all Canadians? The Honourable Government House Leader. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to reassure my honourable colleague, there are no Liberal senators. There are only Conservative senators. And it's Conservative senators who were bullying independent senators because they couldn't exercise their democratic right. The Conservative senators weren't respecting democracy. They weren't respecting Parliament. But the Senate is at an arm's length. It's independent, and they will act independently.
Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister acknowledged missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people as an ongoing genocide. Parliament unanimously recognized it as a nationwide emergency. But how many times does the government's fall economic statement mention MMIWG2S? Zero, Mr. Speaker, zero. This government has a million excuses, but they refuse to take the urgent action that's needed to stop the violence. Can the minister explain why his government's fall economic statement fails to mention this ongoing genocide?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Minister for Crown Indigenous Relations.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for her comments and for her question. Addressing the ongoing violence against Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQ+ people is a whole-of-government approach which requires living up to our moral obligations as a country and to the calls for justice, Mr. Speaker. That's why Budget 2023 invests $125 million to implement the National Action Plan on MMWG, and we will continue to work with our partner, my friend opposite, as well as all Canadians to ensure that we address the issues of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Thank you.
The honourable member from Nunavut.
There are First Nations who cannot return to their home communities due to the lack of homes. They are being pushed out of their culture, family, and traditions due to the neglect from the Liberals. At the pace this government is moving, it would take anywhere between 58 to 141 years to close the infrastructure gap, despite promising that they would close it by 2030. Can this government tell us when enough homes will be built for First Nations to be able to live in their home communities?
The Honourable Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I share the member opposite's sense of urgency for closing the infrastructure in First Nations. And let me tell you, Mr. Speaker, in 2015, we inherited a situation where no investments had been made in housing, and since 2016, 30,000 homes or renovations have been completed across the nations with the leadership of First Nations, investing in new models, ensuring that people have the tools and the support and the equity to be able to continue to close that gap. We'll be there, Mr. Speaker, as a truthful partner with First Nations.
The honourable member from St. John's East.
Every day, approximately 12 people die by suicide in Canada. Each life lost by suicide can have far-reaching effects, whether that's families grappling with the loss of a loved one or the effects that are felt in communities. It's essential for Canadians to have timely access to suicide prevention. They need to know that they are not alone, that there is someone there to help. Can the Minister of Mental Health and Addictions update us on the launch of 988 Suicide Prevention and Emotion Distress Crisis Line?
Great question. The Honourable Minister for Mental Health and Addictions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member from St. John's East, who is a strong advocate on mental health and many other issues. Our hearts go out to all loved ones of those who have lost someone to suicide, and we also reach out to those who struggle with suicidal thoughts. Each life lost shatters an entire family, communities, and so much more. As of today, the people in Newfoundland and Labrador and anywhere in Canada can now call or text 988 to have access to 24/7 bilingual, trauma-informed, and culturally appropriate suicide prevention support. If you're thinking about suicide or worried about someone else thinking about suicide, call or text 988. You are not alone. There is help available. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians know that after 8 years, this Prime Minister is not worth the cost. People see it on their grocery bills, and farmers who grow the food see it while paying for their fuel. A young producer showed me his propane bill for grain drying from the start of harvest. In a span of 12 days, just 12 days, it cost him $950 in carbon tax alone, and harvest was just getting going. He's still waiting to see the final bill from drying his crops. Will the Prime Minister tell his appointed senators to stop delaying Bill C-2, 3, 4, and axe the tax for the farmers who grow our food?
The Honourable Minister for Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the member for the question. In fact, I know he's a very influential member of his caucus, Mr. Speaker, and people watching would know that. Mr. Speaker, if he wants to give a gift to Canadians before Christmas, why don't he convince his caucus colleagues to vote for affordability bill, Mr. Speaker, because in that bill, Canadians know that we will be reforming competition, one of the most fundamental reform in Canadian history, Mr. Speaker. We're going to give more power to the Contribution Bureau. We're going to make sure that they can do the study, Mr. Speaker. Canadians Canadians know that the best way to stabilize price in the country for the mid to long term is to have more competition. Will they do the right thing for Canadians once for all?
Let's see. The honourable member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Well, the fastest way to provide more affordability for Canadians would be to pass Bill C-234. Mr. Speaker, we have the receipts to show just how much the carbon tax costs farmers who grow the food. The natural gas bills for different months from a Saskatchewan farmer show that 1 month without grain drying is $135 a month, but 1 month with grain drying, $6,400. Wow. That's why the House passed Bill C-234 to give farmers tax relief. Who does the Prime Minister think should pay that ridiculous cost? The farmer who grows the food, or the families who are struggling to put food on the table for their kids?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, 2 points. First of all, the only senators that are managed by anyone in this chamber are Conservative senators who sit in the caucus of the Leader of the Opposition. Second point is that if the members opposite were so concerned about food affordability, I would urge them to take a look across the pond at the instability that Vladimir Putin's illegal war is causing to food and supply chains around the planet. Ukraine is traditionally known as the breadbasket of the planet. Food supply issues and the cost of food is directly related to that illegal war. It would be great if the members opposite got behind supports like the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement.
The honourable member from Tobique-Matiquac.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Liberals voted with the Bloc to keep the tax on farmers. This bill would have saved farmers nearly $1 billion between now and 2030. This Christmas season, people are hurting. PEI farmers are paying between $30,000 and $75,000 more a year due to the carbon tax, and a farmer in western New Brunswick has had his cost increased by over 30% on freight alone. This is unbearable for our producers and consumers. When will this Prime Minister finally hear the cries of our farmers and tell his senators to pass Bill 234? Amen.
The Honourable Minister for Agriculture and Agri-Food.
Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, the opposition Conservative Party does not have a plan for the environment. Quite simply, on Prince Edward Island, they're well aware of what the environment can do. With Fiona, we had winds of over 200 kilometers an hour. We destroyed burns. It killed dairy cattle. Quite simply, Mr. Speaker, if you do not deal with the climate, you do not do anything with grocery prices. Our government has a plan for the environment, and we will lower and stabilize the grocery prices. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member from Moose Jaw Lake Centre.
Mr. Speaker, after 8 years of this NDP Liberal government, everyone is struggling. Farmers across Canada buy their goods retail and sell what they produce wholesale. Farmers are now paying $150,000 in the inflationary carbon tax. They know this Prime Minister is just not worth the cost. When will he tell his appointed senators to stop delaying C-234 and axe the tax so people can afford their groceries?
The Honourable Minister for Agriculture and Agri-Food.
Mr. Speaker, again, I tell my honourable colleague what his party and his leader needs is a plan for the environment. We have a plan for the environment, and in fact, just 2 weeks ago, I was able to make an announcement in Manitoba with the government in order to create the last living lab right across this country. And in fact, what goes on with living labs is that scientists, farmers, and the industry.
I'm going to ask again, I've asked a couple of times for these colleagues, please keep your voices down when you don't have the floor. It's time for the minister to answer so that we can all hear the answer. I ask the member from Brantford Brant, please to do so, and South Shore St. Margaret's as well to keep his voice down. The Honourable Minister from the top, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I indicated quite clearly, if you're going to deal with the environment, you have to have a plan for the environment. We have a plan for the environment, and I was just using one of many examples that we have. Living labs right across this country. What we do with living labs is make sure that farmers, scientists, and the industry itself works together in order to make sure we deal with climate change. We produce better crops. We take carbon out of the air and into the soil. We will continue to work with farmers and ranchers right across this country in order to make sure we stabilize food prices right across this country. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Saint-Hyacinthe-Bagotte. Thank you. Well, Mr. Speaker, the National Assembly unanimously criticized Ottawa's decision to give the contract for surveillance aircraft to Boeing without a bid for tender. All of our elected officials in Quebec have criticized this deliberate choice to push aside our aerospace industry. And this is not just depriving the industry of a $9 billion contract. Ottawa is also hurting sales of Quebec aircraft abroad by turning up its nose at our aerospace sector in front of all of our trade partners. This is not a great sales strategy. Do the Liberals realize that they're hurting our aerospace industry throughout the world? The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As my colleague said, developing our aerospace industry is something we will be able to do even more with this morning's announcement. And we will also be giving the armed forces the tools they need to protect us here in Canada and to defend Canada's interest abroad. That is why businesses like CAE and others in Montreal, Mirabel, and elsewhere in Canada will be able to benefit from the various benefits from this morning's announcement. The Honourable Member for Terrebonne. Mr. Speaker, let's be serious. This is abandoning our aerospace industry, giving $9 billion to Boeing without a bid for tender. The Liberals are abandoning our biggest export sector, and they're not just abandoning our large businesses, they also haven't helped SMEs who may end up going bankrupt if nothing is done about paying back the money from the emergency fund. That's the Liberal record. Recently, they've hurt big companies in Quebec and small companies. I would say that ultimately they're hurting the entire economy of Quebec. The Honourable Minister of Public Services and Procurement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Helping Quebec's industry and helping the aerospace industry throughout Canada was one of the goals of today's announcement. Over the next few months, we will see that there will be 3,000 jobs. There will be all sorts of benefits in Canada, including Quebec, with about $400 million a year, and that will further help our workers in the aerospace industry in Quebec and elsewhere in Canada.
The Honourable Member from Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes.
Speaker, this morning the Chiefs of Ontario joined the chorus of Canadians decrying the failure of the Liberal carbon tax. This burden inflicted upon First Nations, allegedly the most important relationship for this Prime Minister, has forced 133 chiefs to take the government to court in order to get relief. It's clear Indigenous communities are not better off after 8 long years of this government, nor is more money being put back in the pockets of the people who pay this tax. After yet another failure, Speaker, will the Prime Minister realize that the carbon tax has failed Indigenous peoples and finally axe the tax?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. You know, this summer we saw a record wildfire season raging across the country, and I, as Minister of Indigenous Services Canada, worked with First Nations leaders all across the country as they did the most unmanageable to protect their communities. Evacuations, Mr. Speaker, people displaced for weeks, if not months, Mr. Speaker, land and property and infrastructure destroyed. We'll continue to work on fighting climate change and protecting people as we see this astronomical threat bearing down, and I look forward to doing that with First Nations leaders.
The Honourable Member from Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes.
Thank you very much, Speaker. Actually, the Auditor General had a plan for that. It was approved, the 112 infrastructure projects sitting on that minister's desk that would deal with the effects of climate change, adaptation and mitigation. In fact, it was Indigenous projects that talked about dikes, dams, and culverts, things that would give Indigenous communities the fighting chance to stay on their land in the event of an extreme weather event. But this minister would rather waste money. Instead of investing $6 to save those $1 to save $6, and rather than the current plan of evacuation, relocation, and rebuilding. When will this minister get serious about helping Indigenous communities? Listen to the Chiefs of Ontario. Axe the tax.
The Honourable Minister for Indigenous Services.
Speaker, it's too bad that the former leader of the opposition didn't listen to the Chiefs of Ontario for over a decade as the infrastructure gap grew and grew and grew, as children suffered with discriminatory First Nations child welfare, as education rates and levels were underfunded per capita.
I'm having trouble once again listening to the honourable member. There have been a number of voices close to the speaker. I'm going to ask the honourable minister, please, to start again because I would like to hear the answer.
Mr. Speaker, you have to ask yourself, how did that infrastructure gap get so big? And it was a decade of neglect. In fact, Mr. Speaker, the leader of the opposition on the day of the apology of Prime Minister Harper said that what people really needed to do was actually get to work and show work values. These are the kinds of ethics that these Conservatives hold in terms of First Nations. We'll continue to work with First Nations on rights in respectful ways, in closing gaps, Mr. Speaker. That's what responsible governments do.
Read the report. I'm going to ask all members once again to please listen to the whips as they're trying to give signs for folks to keep it together. The Honourable Député de Chicoutimi.
The Honourable Member for Chicoutimi-Le-Fjord. Mr. Speaker, once again yesterday, we saw that this Liberal Bloc coalition is not worth the cost. The Bloc joined the Liberals, as usual, to reject our motion to ask the Senate to adopt our common sense bill, C-234, to exempt farmers from the carbon tax. After 8 years, with food banks struggling, these two parties want to increase the tax even more radically. Will the Prime Minister tell his own appointed senators to stop blocking C-234? The Honourable Minister of Public Services and Procurement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What Conservative senators ought to say to Conservative MPs is that the price on pollution reduces pollution, it puts more money in the pockets of 8 out of 10 families, and it creates the jobs we need for the economy of the future. We all know that the official policy of the Conservative elite is that climate change doesn't exist, but this is 2023, and we're counting on Conservative senators and MPs to review that position.
The Honourable Member from Don Valley East.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm a proud Canadian. I'm proud of this nation's bilingualism, and I'm proud of the federal government's role in promoting both official languages. In the House of Commons, it is a privilege for me to hear both official languages being used. Therefore, I was both shocked and disappointed at the Canadian Heritage Committee this morning when a Conservative MP asked a Francophone minister from Quebec to answer her question in English. Could the Minister of Canadian Heritage tell this House about the long-standing importance of the official language use in this government? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his question. I'd like to start by saying that I'm a proud Quebecer, a proud Francophone. I'm very proud to be able to speak French, and I would like to remind us all that we have the right to express our opinions in the language of our choice, no matter what the language the question was asked in. I was very pleased to be able to speak about the agreement with Google, but unfortunately, a member of the Conservative caucus used that opportunity to question my right to express myself in my mother tongue. We are the first government to have recognized the decline of French. Bilingualism is a fundamental principle of our country. We will continue to defend and promote it, despite the fact that the Conservatives don't seem to like that.
The Honourable Member from Thornhill.
Minister said that he would drop $15 billion on Stellantis to create new jobs. What he didn't say is that those jobs wouldn't be located in Windsor, in Ontario, or even in Canada. He's shipping taxpayer money to a Dutch company that's going to employ Korean foreign workers. Another slap in the face to hardworking Canadians who are struggling after 8 years of this government. They can't get their story straight on how many foreign jobs this $15 billion is buying. So why not release the contracts for Canadians to see for themselves?
Common sense.
The Honourable Minister for Innovation.
I'm afraid I'll have to say we'll take no lessons from a party for the leader. When he was Employment Minister, Mr. Speaker, imagine not that he oversaw the loss of 3,000, not the loss of 30,000, the loss of 300,000 manufacturing jobs in this country, Mr. Speaker. And this man would like to tell us what to do, Mr. Speaker. Canadians know better. We'll continue to invest in Windsor. We'll invest in the auto sector. We'll invest in our workers. We'll invest in a prosperous Canada, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member from Thornhill.
Mr. Speaker, he should take some lessons from this side. The story changes every single time he is asked. He should admit that Canadians got robbed blind with this deal. The Prime Minister even told his backbench to keep this all a secret and talk out the clock so they don't have to release documents. There's no reason to do that unless they're hiding something. Yes. So we want to know what's in this deal, why he spent $15 billion to ship Canadian jobs overseas and pretend that after 8 years they care about labor in this country. Why so secret? What are they hiding?
Hey! Good job.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Speaker, 2,500 workers in Windsor building batteries. Canadian, local, unionized. An additional 2,300 construction jobs. Canadian, local. That message was delivered in Parliament Hill yesterday by Dave Cassidy, the president of Unifor Local 444. He represents 5,000 Stellantis workers. He will represent the 2,500 Windsor workers that will build the batteries. Who do you trust, Mr. Speaker? The guy who spent his whole life fighting for workers, or the guy who spent his whole life, his whole political career, fighting workers?
The Honourable Member from Montmagny-Lilley, Kamouraska, Rivière-du-Loup. Mr. Speaker, Quebecers are learning that the Northvolt battery factory in Quebec will be using hundreds of foreign replacement workers. That's $7 billion in taxpayer money, which will be used to fund jobs that should belong to Quebecers. Once again, this Prime Minister is just not worth the cost. After 8 years in power, this Prime Minister is failing to protect Quebecers' jobs. He should make the contracts public. He should make them public. I'm just going to put on my glasses here. He needs to make these contracts public for the battery factories. When will he do that? The Honourable Minister of Innovation. Mr. Speaker, I'm glad that my colleague put his glasses on, because I think he should start writing down some of the numbers here. The Conservative Party is never in favor of investing in the battery industry. They were against the GM investment. They were against Ford. They were against the Volkswagen investment. And now they're against Stellantis investment, which is going to create 2,500 jobs at the factory and up to 2,300 to build the factory, Mr. Speaker. It's absolutely scandalous. Canadians can clearly see what side the Conservatives are on, and it's clearly not on workers' side.
Member from Malpeque.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the loss of innocent lives in the Middle East as a result of the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas has been tragic. There is an increasingly dire need to ensure aid gets into Gaza, where civilians are suffering. Canadians want to know how the government is helping bring relief to the region. Can the Minister of International Development please update the House and Canadians what our government is doing to provide help to those desperately in need?
The Honourable Minister for International Development.
Speaker, I want to thank my colleague for the question. Canada was the first Western government to take action by providing $60 million in aid for civilians affected by the conflict in Gaza. This included a matching fund that brought in 12 Canadian humanitarian organizations, and I'm pleased to share with this House that Canadians from coast to coast donated almost $14 million to this campaign. and we will double this amount to nearly $28 million. This funding will go to provide much-needed water, food, and medicines to all civilians affected by this conflict. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Rosemont-Patry. Mr. Speaker, Quebec is known worldwide for its aerospace expertise. We have the skills and the workforce, and yet when we need new aircraft, the Liberals are deciding to use an American company, and for outdated aircraft, on top of everything else. Why not have an open and transparent bid for tender, which would enable companies like Bombardier to bid? This is mismanagement of public funds. We're talking about well-paid union jobs that are being ultimately lost to Quebec. Why aren't the Liberals helping our aerospace industry? The Honourable Minister of Public Services and Procurement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank our colleague for giving me a chance to talk a little more about this subject. This morning's news is excellent news for the armed forces, who will have aircraft that are designed for the critical situation we're now facing globally. This is also good news for the aerospace industry throughout the country. We know that providers will be receiving investments of $400 million a year with hundreds of jobs, and we know that various companies like CAE and our partnerships with Polytechnique and the Université de Sherbrooke will benefit a great many stakeholders throughout the country.
No point of order for question period. There's one more question on the list. L'honorable député de Richmond.
The Honourable Member for Richmond North Basca. Mr. Speaker, in this House, we often criticize the government vigorously, but we should also congratulate it when it does good things. I'd like to thank the Minister for her hard work to sign this first agreement with a web giant, Google. This will help our media, but I'd like to ask her to confirm that some measures have been taken to support our local and regional media. For example, in my riding, there are various small newspapers and radio stations. So I'd like to hear from her whether measures or guidelines have been put in place to ensure that these local media can also have their fair share and that this will support them in future. The Honourable Minister of Canadian Heritage. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague. I recall when I was at the National Federation of Culture and I would come here to discuss the importance of protecting our media, my colleague, even though he was part of the Conservative caucus at the time, always spoke up for media, including rural media. So I'm pleased to be able to tell him that under the agreement, there will be a place for local and regional media at the negotiation table, as well as official language minority media. That will be good for all media in the country, and we're really keeping a spot at the table for local and regional media. Thank you.